One thing that we often do on a poetry night is read some kind of invocation, mostly to help to settle the mind, to prepare it for listening better. So tonight for the invocation, I'm actually going to just sing a very short tune that was taught to me by my peer, Goliath. Very simple tune. The words are return again, return to the home of your soul. Return again, return to the home of your soul. Return to who you are. Return to what you are. Return to where you are born and reborn again. Return again. Return again. Return to the home of your soul.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming tonight. And I'd like to begin. My name is Bill Wolak. I'm a poet. I'm from New Jersey. I'm a colleague of Mahmood, Karimi, Hakak, who will be talking after me. And we usually like to begin our presentations with a little bit of contextualization of what the poetry of Hafez might be for those of you who have not had that. And so usually I begin with a little bit of a background about Hafez and why we decided to spend about 7 years struggling and wrestling in language to try and bring this Persian mystic's poetry into English, wrestle it into English as best we could. So we met at Rutgers University in about 1978, have been friends for a very long time. And one thing that happened very frequently whenever we were together on holidays like Nowruz or on birthdays or anniversaries or just any time when we were drinking together or just having fun. Mahmood would bring out Hafez, open the book and put his finger down and find a verse that would explain what was about to happen, and in that way, and it's, you know, it's amazing, that divination. We used to do that type of divination with Virgil's Aeneid at another point in time. Now it's a common custom in Iran to do this, and it's a custom that I learned from Mahmood, and it's very it's a lovely tradition. And so as we matured together and grew together and were friends for many years, a couple of times we discussed the idea of working together on a translation project. Sometimes one poet or another, depending on who we were talking about. We are great lovers of Rumi. We always were interested in mysticism and Sufism especially. But Hafez was a project that was a little bit different. I knew it was difficult, and I knew there were many translations, and I knew there were many places that one could make a fall and have a difficult time. So we never really got started on it until about 7 years ago. One day he had moved to a place. He's been traveling and moving and living in different places in Iran for 7 or 8 years, and then he was in Houston, Texas, and so then he moved close enough, 3 hours away in Albany, where we could commute and where we could see each other, and I could get there for a weekend, and we could do a certain amount of work and have a result after a long period of time. So we began, we sat down and we said, okay, do you want to make a commitment to do something like this? Where do we begin? And it's a fact. He took out the book, opened it up, and said, this is where we'll begin, right here. And so we took out a legal pad, honestly, and some Persian-English dictionaries, English-Persian dictionaries, a thesaurus, and we began this work. And that's how we translated the 50 ghazals, opening to the book and pointing and starting from there. And as we went through this process, we discovered a lot of things about Hafez. It was a long journey, and we discovered a lot of things about ourselves. And let me just say a few words about that. Actually, it was a kind of journey through friendship. It's almost now we describe it as almost like a marriage, because we've been it's a routine, you know. It's that we have together. It's a work routine. It's a discipline. It's a love. It's a way of keeping each other alive. It's a way of celebrating. It's a way of bringing other people into the circle, and it's a way of sharing, because it's a cross-cultural phenomenon. And so when we started looking at the language, we had to make a lot of choices. And the first choice is, of course, are we going to rhyme these or not? And so we argued about that for a little while, and then we decided not to rhyme them. And we said, look, let's try and make it as clear as possible, a literal translation of what's happening in these texts. And so that's what we attempted to do, to make the text as clear and comprehensible with the least amount of footnotes, and contextualizing a little bit more in the introduction. And that's what we attempted. Next, as we were looking through these poems, the first thing that we really encountered was this basic fundamental question: why Hafez? And this came to me again when we were speaking to a doctor in Montreal, a dentist, a woman who couldn't come to our reading there because she had gone to a wedding. And she said it was the most perfect wedding she'd ever been to. Everyone from the age of 4 to 80 participated. It was an event that was filled with love and filled with this interconnection of generations, and a real celebration. And as she described it to me, it sounded great. And at the center of the celebration was, of course, the giving of 2 books, the Quran and the Divan of Hafez. And so this kind of shocked me, and I said, really? And this was last night, and they were given these 2 books. How wonderful! In Hafezology, that's almost a cliche that every book in Iran, every home in Iran has these 2 books, the Quran and the Divan of Hafez. And that's where we began trying to explain to each other why that happened, what it is about the Divan of Hafez that makes it so beloved by the Iranian people. And that's where our investigation began. And our tentative answer is that Hafez in some way represents freedom. And right now, with the struggle that's happening in Iran, this is a wonderful time to be thinking about that ability to conceptualize freedom given by a poet and an entire civilization in these various songs. And so the first thing we want to try and distinguish is the way that freedom is represented in Hafez's poems. The most obvious way, of course, is that this is a great poet of love. He is perhaps one of the world's great, along with Rumi and Goethe and Shelley and Keats, poets who have spoken through the heart, know what love is, and use that itself as the very metaphor for spiritual union. So the quest of the lover and the beloved is the quest for union with the rest of the universe. And in Iran, this is the way that it will be represented. It's almost similar to what happens in India, where the object of love is somehow separated from the lover, and that separation is what the lover feels, and it's an agony and it's a torment, and it's excruciating. And so what is the path that one can take to get to the beloved, or to open to the beloved? And that is what we're looking at in Hafez. In the Tantric tradition, of course, it would be lovemaking. In the Iranian tradition, where probably due to Islamic stricture on the representation of the body, it becomes wine. And so this is the primary source of the liberation in Hafez's poetry, because it also has to do with a form of liberation. In the tradition of Hafez, the drinking of wine, and again, it's operating on two levels. It's operating on a literal level and on a symbolic level. The goal is union, is this moment, this ineffable moment of coming together with the other. All of the universe, one particular person, everything in the universe simultaneously. And this is a mystical concept. It's extremely difficult to describe and explain. So what Hafez does is try and make it as concrete an experience as possible by making the object of that desire and that love into something that is beautiful. It might be the beloved, it might be the friend, it could be the guest in the language of love and its related symbols and images. It's going to be the saki, or the beautiful wine pourer. And that is what is going to open up the meaning of wine. So at the very beginning, you have this rather complex operation happening, since in Persian itself, the pronouns have no gender referent. It's impossible to know in the poem itself what the object is in terms of gender. So it could be male, it could be female, and to make matters even more complex, style of dress, style of hair, style of beauty is exactly the same for the saki in male and female. So to a certain degree, unless he describes secondary sexual characteristics, and Hafez very rarely does. The long hair, the long curly hair, the beauty mark, the smile, the eyes, the eyebrows that are like a bow. These can be used for either sex, and we'll do some variation of the genders to see what the different effect might be. So the saki is up to you. The difficulty is trying to maintain that objective, non-gendered orientation. So the saki is there to pour the wine. The wine is the symbol of love. The lover has an empty cup. The beloved has a decanter filled with love. And the operation is always going to be from the pouring of that wine that will lead to what? The intoxication of love. A moment that is described in Sufi literature and in Hindu literature and in Buddhist literature as an ineffable experience, something that is almost beyond conceptualization. In order to make it concrete, Hafez has used this language of wine drinking so that everyone will understand the point that he's trying to make about the essence of love and about its universal experience. And that is that suddenly the individual is opened or ripped open, or in some way finds a connection with everything in the universe. In Sanskrit, that would be tattvamasi, I am that. I understand that I am intimately connected with everything out there. A similar experience is what Hafez is aiming at with this intoxication of wine. So when Hafez begins to talk about the drinking of wine, the use of wine as an intoxicant that is being poured by the beloved, the distance between the beloved, the separation between the beloved and lover, this is what he's aiming at. He's aiming at a mystical state on the one hand and literal wine drinking on the other. And some of the debate about what the meaning of the poems, the ultimate meaning of the poem is, operates between the ambiguity of the symbolic level and the literal level, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, so we have a certain amount of symbolism in wine that's important, and we have a variety of other things that operate as well in Hafez. Our basic notion in this tour, in this group of talks and readings, is that Hafez represents freedom in a way. And one of the ways that we found out about that is through discussion, by talking to one another. For example, when we were talking about wine, the strange thing that happened was that we began by trying to figure out what would be the best way to describe the meeting place where all of this happens. Can we use the word tavern? Do we want to use bar? Are there other options? And we would go over and over which would be the best option to pick. Then, in the middle of this difficult lexical decisions, essentially, we began to talk personally about this. I said, well, what does wine mean to you, Mahmood? And he would describe to me what happened to him as a child and as a young man growing up in an Islamic country where wine was forbidden. And I contrasted that with my deep understanding of what wine meant growing up as a Catholic and studying to be an altar boy, and the difference between wine. We found that essentially we weren't talking about the same wine. We weren't even having the same sets of images, because what was forbidden for him was sacred for me. It was at the center of Mass and meant the transubstantiation of God, basically, into something that can be taken into the human. And so out of that came probably our most interesting insights about what is different about us, and out of what is different, what we can find that is similar. So that led us really to really investigate a little bit more about the meaning of wine in the whole tradition of Islam. And so, as I said, coming from a Western background where it's a wine-positive civilization, where wine is part of the meal, and where you go into a restaurant and there's a wine list. How different must the experience of wine be in Iran, where you can be arrested quite literally for being in possession of a bottle of wine, where before Islam, in Persian history, wine was accepted and used in the same way that it was in Greece and was loved from very early on. And even in Zoroastrianism, we have very wine-positive civilization where the wine is used in several ceremonies, to the complete negation, or almost complete negation, of wine in Islam. So as Islam made wine prohibited, what did that mean? Well, we began to look at why it was prohibited by Islam, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The most basic one is that Islam is a family-centered religion, and what happens in wine drinking sometime is that the person who is drinking loses control of themselves, their money, their possessions, and their family. And so this was very dangerous to Muhammad, and Muhammad said, therefore, wine drinking is not a good idea if it can lead to the destruction of the family. We need to preserve and prop up the union of family members, and so that is not a good idea. In the Quran, the secondary explanation, of course, is that wine itself accentuates what happens to the individual. And so if you drink wine and you're a good person, you'll be a happy drunk and you'll spread that glow of happiness to all the people around you. But if you're an unhappy drunk, and if you're conflicted in some way, or if there's something in there that's not so good, that also will be amplified, and that can lead to jealousy, murder, and destruction. And so the idea is that the reason why there are rivers of wine in paradise is because only the good will get to drink it, and only good things will come from that, and that will amplify goodness, whereas it would be dangerous for someone at any time who is not good to drink wine. And so that's the explanation for why there is wine in heaven and why there is no wine on earth. And now to the contradiction that we find now. What does it mean to have an Islamic civilization, as Iran is, to have as their leading poet, a poet who talks in most of his poems, and in our selection of 51, only 4 do not mention wine. And I think that would be a pretty good representation of the number that do not. So at the center of their civilization, what does it mean that here is a poet who speaks on every page about wine, wine drinking, and of course this other term that's untranslatable, the rend, or the libertine, the one who is a wine drinker, the one who is happy drinking wine. And so this is what we found really to be the interesting aspect about Hafez, and that is that he is someone who is finding a path for freedom, someone who's trying to stretch out the envelope of what's possible for people. Someone who represents, the way that Whitman does in our tradition, freedom. So we have a chapter title called Freedom Sounds Like Hafez. What Hafez is doing in saying that love is the most important thing in the world and what will ultimately bring people together. That wine is something that can do the same type of thing, that will bring the intoxication of love into your life, spiritual or literal. These images teach people in a particular way something very different from the other book in the home, the Quran. And this became very evident to us when we were reading in Soho about a week ago, when after we read, we usually have a discussion period, which is more interesting than the poetry reading itself. And one Iranian American stood up and said, "This is exactly what happened to me." There's no one that I knew had ever met, or Mahmood had ever met. And he said, "When I was 14 years old, my brother gave me this book of Hafez, the Divan of Hafez. And I began to read this book. And this book changed something in my mind. It opened my mind to other possibilities in the world. That there are laws and there are other laws, and there's a whole mystical way of interpreting the universe that is very different from what we find in the Quran. And this is what led me to pursue dancing and other aspects of my life that became the joy of my life, because I was able to find this free thinker, this person who not only expanded the possibility of what was possible for a human being, but was able to criticize those who, in ways that that other people had not done. And so you'll hear in Hafez, besides this opening of the mind and opening of the heart, also a pointing at people who are acting inappropriately. And so he'll say, you know, we have hypocrites. Beware of these ascetics who do one thing on the pulpit and another thing when they are alone. And he contrasts people. He says, these are the good people, these are the bad people. And so we began to develop a whole catalog of types in Hafez, those who are insiders, who Hafez likes, and those who are outsiders. And the religious people who are mostly on the outside, the mullahs and the clerics and the police, all of those people are on the outside, have no spiritual understanding, want to have strictures on the people and keep them in control. And on the other hand, who are the people who are the insiders? They are the lovers. They are the one who is aching from separation. The saki, the tavern keeper, the one who is who provides the space like this for people to come together and think together and feel together and have the experience of hearing and listening and talking about these ideas. So the tavern space is very important as well. Other insiders would include great lovers of history and a whole network of illusions that are not common to the West. And so in some cases you need to use footnotes for them. We haven't chosen any of those poems here. Okay, so I think I've tried to explain a little bit about the overall ideas that and the way that we've interpreted and the way that we've tried to put together the poems. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague Mahmood, Karimi, Hakak, who will talk a little bit about the way that we work together and other aspects of the translation.
Thank you, Bill. I'll be very quick. I think Bill eloquently spoke about how we have worked together on the translation and Hafez and all that. I'd like to talk about, touch upon why this tour and why did we decide to do this readings, agree to do this tour and these readings. There is, as Bill mentioned, there's a chapter in the introduction that begins with Hafez sounds like freedom, or freedom sounds like Hafez. So the question for us was, what would Hafez say if he was in the streets of Tehran today? What would he do? Where would he be? Where would he place himself? Would he be a part of the insiders or the outsiders, or a part of both, bringing both together, as we hope to happen? As such, we decided that Hafez would perhaps address every single issue that exists in today's Iran, and perhaps stand with those people who are fighting to push the envelope, who are fighting to open the society, who are fighting, who are giving their lives to bring about a democracy that we have for so long waiting for. There are, you probably have all seen one of the most beautiful poems I have ever encountered in my life, which has come out of this movement. One of the most universal and most beautiful poems that has come out of it, and I wish we had this in 2000. The year 2000 in America. As such, we chose 7 poems that would, and this time this is our choice, it's not Hafez's, so we take the blame for it. We chose 7 poems that would, we hope to represent any one of the days of the week in Iran. Each for a day of a week in Iran. And that's what we are going to read for you. And we are hoping that the energies like this that we've seen here would contribute to this strength that my sons, sisters, brothers, fathers, and mothers in Iran need to go on searching and struggling to gain what they really so much deserve. I'd like to ask a favor of all of you, and that is, if you would, please, I would like you to stand up and observe a moment of silence for those countrymen and countrywomen of mine who have lost their lives in this path. Thank you very much. Thank you. My colleague Bill will read the poems. We have an agreement that if the number of Iranians in our audience are more than the number of Americans, we will begin with Persian. And if the number of Americans, English-speaking, I shouldn't say Americans, English-speaking audience are more than the Persian-speaking audience, then we'll begin with English. And as such, I ask Bill to please begin. He will read a poem, and then we'll have music.
We'll start with music.
Or we start with music, and then English, and then I will recite them in Persian for you.
In wine's ruin, I glimpse the light of creation. How strange, sensing such radiance in such wreckage. Don't swagger for me, holiest of pilgrims, because you see only the house, while I see the owner of the house. Don't swagger for me, holiest of pilgrims, because you see only the house. I see the owner of the house. I long for the lover's hair, untied and falling free. Such a favor poses far-reaching implications. Maybe it's a mistake. The heart's burning, pouring tears, sighs at night, crying all night long. I count these as gifts of your kindness. Every moment my dream draws a different picture of you. To whom could I explain what I see on that canvas? From deer's musk gland to distilled perfume, no one has savored the scent I'm offered each morning in dawn's breeze. Friends, don't find fault with Hafez for flirting, because I recognize him as your lover's beloved. Friends, don't find fault with Hafez for flirting, because I recognize him as your lover's beloved.
در خرابات مغان نور خدا میبینم. این عجب بین که چه نوری ز کجا میبینم. جلوه بر من مفروش ای ملک الحاج، که تو خانه میبینی و من خانه خدا میبینم. خواهم از زلف بتان ناف گشایی کردن، فکر دور است همانا که خطا میبینم. سوز دل، اشک روان، آه سحر، ناله شب، این همه از نظر لطف شما میبینم. هر دم از روی تو نقشی زندم راه خیال، با که گویم که در این پرده چه ها میبینم. کس ندیده است ز مشک ختن و نافه چین آنچه من هر سحر از باد صبا میبینم. دوستان، دوستان، عیب نظربازی حافظ نکنید که من او را ز محبان شما میبینم.
I won't quit loving the friend in wine. Hundreds of times I've repented, but never again. Garden of Eden, creation's tree, and even virgins of paradise can't compare with the dirt of the friend's alleyway. Lectures and homework instilling knowledge contain only a hint. I just gave you an aside, and I'm not about to repeat myself. I'm never aware of what's going on inside my head until it rises above everyone in the middle of the tavern. Sarcastically, the teacher said, "Abandon loving. No need quarreling, brother. I just won't stop. This much virtue is enough for me, that I don't flirt with the city's beauties from the pulpit. Hafez, the guide's living presence dispenses real wealth. I'll never stop kissing the dirt beneath such feet. Hafez, the guide's living presence dispenses real wealth. I'll never stop kissing the dirt beneath such feet."
من ترک عشق شاهد و ساغر نمی کنم، 100 بار توبه کردم و دیگر نمی کنم. باغ بهشت و سایه طوبی و قصر و نور با خاک پای دوست برابر نمی کنم. تلقین و درس اهل نظر یک اشارت است، گفتم کنایتی و مکرر نمی کنم. هرگز نمی شود ز سر خود خبر مرا، تا در میان میکده سر بر نمی کنم. ناصح به تن گفت که رو ترک عشق کن، محتاج جنگ نیست برادر نمی کنم. این تقویم تمام که با شاهدان شهر ناز و کرشمه از سر منبر نمی کنم. حافظ جناب پیر مغان جای دولت است، من ترک خاکبوسی این در نمی کنم.
Hey, since you're so proud of yourself, if you don't love, you're dismissed. Don't hang around with those who are crazy with love, if you're only famous for upright wisdom. The drunkenness of love doesn't exist in you. Go away. You're high on wine. The pallid face and the painful sigh are the lover's cure for this condition. Leave behind fame and shame, Hafez. Because you need drunkenness, ask for a wine glass.
ای که دایم به خویش مغروری، گر تو را عشق نیست معذوری. گرد دیوانگان عشق مگرد، که به عقل عقیله مشهوری. مستی عشق نیست در سر تو رو، که تو مست آب انگوری. روی زرد است و آه دردآلود عاشقان را دوای رنجوری. روی زرد است و آه دردآلود عاشقان را دوای رنجوری. بگذر از نام و ننگ خود حافظ، ساغر می طلب که مخموری.
God forbid I abandon drinking in spring. God forbid I abandon drinking in spring. I brag about my wisdom. Why should I do such a thing? Where is the musician who will encourage me to commit my knowledge and devotion to the service of the harp, the lyre, and singing. I'm depressed from all the nitpicking my school's been teaching me. I'm depressed from all the nitpicking my school's been teaching me. I need to be in the service of lovers and wine for a while. When did faithfulness ever exist in the world? Bring me a glass of wine so that I may divulge all about Jamshid and Kavas. I'm not afraid of the black report card of my sins on Judgment Day. With His grace and kindness, I'll survive 100 such documents. Where's dawn's messenger? To that happy and auspicious light, I can complain about our night's separation. This borrowed life that's been lent to Hafez by the friend. Someday, I'll gaze into the friend's face and repay that debt. This borrowed life that's been lent to Hafez by the friend. Someday, I'll gaze into the friend's face and repay that debt.
حاشا که من به موسم گل ترک می کنم، من لاف عقل میزنم، این کار کی کنم؟ مطرب کجاست تا همه محصول زهد و علم در کار چنگ و بربط و آواز نی کنم؟ از قیل و قال مدرسه حالی دلم گرفت، یک چند نیز خدمت معشوق و می کنم. کی بود در زمان وفا جام می بیار تا من حکایت جمشید و کاووس کی کنم؟ از نامه سیاه نترسم که روز حشر با فیض لطف او سر از این نامه طی کنم. کو پیک صبح تا گله های شب فراق با آن خجسته طالع فرخنده پی کنم. این جان عاریت که به حافظ سپرد دوست، این جان عاریت که به حافظ سپرد دوست، روزی رخش ببینم و تسلیم وی کنم.
Let's hope they open the tavern's door soon and untie the knot of our unfinished work. Let's hope they open the tavern's door soon and untie the knot of our unfinished work. If they choose to satisfy selfish ascetics closing its door, keep hoping that they will open it for the sake of God. Because of the heart's enjoyment of toasting libertines, at the start of every prayer, many closed doors swing wide open. We'll write the condolence letter of the dying young grapes so that all the young tavern keepers untie their hair and let it fall free. The harp's hair was torn out, mourning the young wine's death. May blood drip from the rival's eyelids. They closed the door of the tavern. Then God, never allow them to open the door of deceit and hypocrisy. They closed the door of the tavern. Then God, never allow them to open the door of deceit and hypocrisy. Hafez, from underneath the very robe you're wearing today, once you're dead, they'll deceitfully pull any justification for heresy they need.
بود آیا که در میکده ها بگشایند، گره از کار فرو بسته ما بگشایند؟ اگر از بحر دل زاهد خودبین بستند، دل قوی دار که از بحر خدا بگشایند. به صفای دل رندان صبوحی زدگان بستر بسته به مفتاح دعا بگشایند. نامه تعزیت دختر رز بنویسید تا همه مغبچگان زلف دوتا بگشایند. گیسوی چنگ ببرید به مرگ می ناب تا حریفان همه خون از مژه ها بگشایند. در میخانه ببستند خدایا مپسند که در خانه تزویر و ریا بگشایند. حافظ این خرقه که داری تو ببینی فردا که چه زنار ز زیرش به دغا بگشایند. حافظ این خرقه که داری تو ببینی فردا که چه زنار ز زیرش به دغا بگشایند.
My heart's infatuated. My heart's infatuated by a passionate gypsy. She promises lies. She kills with flair. Thousands of clothes of virtue and abstaining were sacrificed, shirts torn off, those with beautiful faces. I'll bear the dream of your beauty mark to my grave, where it will permeate the dirt with perfume. Angels don't know about love. Ask for a wine glass, mix rose water with Adam's clay. Angels don't know about love. Ask for a wine glass, mix rose water and Adam's clay. Sow a wine glass into my shroud so that on Judgment Day, wine might release me from my fear of punishment. I arrived at your steps poor and tired. Have pity on me. There's nothing to hold on to but friendship. I arrived at your doorsteps tired and poor. Have pity on me. There's nothing to hold on to but friendship. Listen to what the secret voice of the tavern told me last night. Stick with pleasure. Flee from fate. There's no obstacle between the lover and the beloved. You separate yourself, Hafez. Get out of the middle.
دلم رمیده ی لولی وشیست شورانگیز، دروغ وعده و قتال وضع و رنگامیز. فدای پیرهن چاک ماهرویان باد هزار جامه تقوا و خرقه پرهیز. خیال خال تو با خود به خاک خواهم برد. خیال خال تو با خود به خاک خواهم برد که تازه خال تو خاکم شود عبیرآمیز. فرشته عشق نداند که چیست، فرشته عشق نداند که چیست. ای ساقی بخواه جام و گلابی به خاک آدم ریز. پیاله بر کفنم بند تا سحرگه حشر به میز دل ببرم حول روز رستاخیز. فقیر و خسته به درگاهت آمدم رحمی، که جز ولای تو هم نیست هیچ دستاویز. بیا که هاتف میخانه دوش با من گفت که در مقام قضا باش و که در مقام رضا باش و از قضا مگریز. میان عاشق و معشوق هیچ حایل نیست، میان عاشق و معشوق هیچ حایل نیست. تو خود حجاب خودی حافظ، از میان برخیز.
It's the beginning. It's the beginning of spring. It's the beginning of spring. Try and be happy, because many times flowers will blossom and you'll be the mud. It's the beginning of spring. Try and be happy, because many times flowers will blossom again and you will be the mud. Now, I'm not telling you who to sit with and what to think, because you'll know that yourself if you're clever and wise. The harp hints the same advice to you secretly. However, advice will only help you if you become worthy. In the meadow, every blade of grass evokes an unmistakable feeling. What a waste to be ignorant of all this creation. The world's misery will subtract the present moment from your life uselessly if day and night you remain entangled in such a disagreeable story. Although there's a dangerous path full of fear from us to the friend, going will be easy once you're acquainted with the destination. Although there's a dangerous path full of fear from us to the friend, going will be easy once you're acquainted with the destination. Hafez, if good luck offers you any assistance, you'll be hunted by the beloved's breathtaking face.
در گل باشی. من نگویم که کنون با که نشین و چه بنوش، که تو خود دانی اگر زیرک و عاقل باشی. چنگ در پرده همین میدهدت پند، ولی وعظت آنگاه کند سود که قابل باشی. در چمن هر ورقی دفتر حالی دگر است. در چمن هر ورقی دفتر حالی دگر است. حیف باشد که ز کار همه غافل باشی. نقد عمرت ببرد قصه دنیا به گزاف، گر شب و روز در این قصه مشکل باشی. گرچه راهیست پر از بیم ز ما تا بر دوست، رفتن آسان بود ار واقف منزل باشی. حافظا گر مدد از بخت بلندت باشد، سید آن شاهد مطبوع شمایل باشی.
All right, thanks very much. This was the reading of some of the poems, but now even more important is an intimate talking about anything that these poems bring up, any questions that you have for either of us about our translations, the process of translation, about Iran, about Mahmood, myself, our friendship, and this tour. We'll sit here and please someone ask a question.
And let me just add that with this presentation, normally we have a slideshow that pictures that are chosen from the struggle of Iranians in the streets today, throughout. And interestingly enough, it seems even though we are not trying to match picture with words, and that's impossible to do, it seems like, for example, when Hafez talks about every blade of grass, you know, has a different feelings, has distinguished feelings. It communicates to many of our Iranian friends who are abroad, who are outside of this country, and they have a way of thinking of their own, and they believe it's only their way or the highway. It really brings home the idea that people who are in the streets of Tehran today have learned the fantastic lesson that they do have 2 ears and 1 mouth.
Mahmood, you haven't been asked a question yet, so please. Yes, please. What's your name again?
Lynn Anderson.
Okay, Lynn.
What would the supreme leader in Iran say about these poems? And I'm stunned, in a way. That was so wonderful the way you both read.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. But what would they say about the poems, and your translation of them? Can you make something up? You don't know, maybe.
I will try. And I will try to
Not
make
what you would expect either.
Yeah.
I will try to make something up that at least would make sense to myself, if not to anybody else. There is a great teacher of us used to tell us that in any religion in the world, whether an existing one or one that will be existed in the future, that will come about in the future, there are 2 ways of looking at it: the artistic way and the non-artistic way. The artistic way allows for the openness, allows for creativity, allows for interpretation, allows for freedom, allows for pushing the envelope, allows for understanding, allows for communication. It's a tolerant. It's a way that you tolerate others. The non-artistic is the dogmatic way, is the way of hypocrisy, is the way that the supreme leader would probably look at it. So Hafez, the reason that Hafez has existed for so long is because they cannot do anything with Hafez. Remember, he's a man throughout our history, throughout the Islamic history, that knows Quran in 14 different renditions. 14 different renditions, and there are only 13 renditions that are known. There are only 13 renditions that people have talked about and are known. Hafez knows it in 14 different renditions. Now, it's my personal belief that he doesn't know it because he believes so strongly on every single word that Quran says, or every one of those interpretations of what Quran says. But he knows it because he can answer, he can respond to any way of turning the word around and interpreting the way that the supreme leader and people like him are interpreting it. He can turn around and respond. In that sense, they cannot do anything with him. Bill spoke about how in every Iranian house there are two books, Quran and Hafez. Remember, over 14% of Iranians are non-Muslims today. And I'm sure that in their houses there is no Quran.
Another way of answering that question is the fact that Ayatollah Khomeini himself wrote mystical love poetry in which this network of symbolism of wine and winekeeper was part. And so you can find on the internet these translations of Ayatollah Khomeini's poems about the beloved, about wine, the sake. He uses all of those images, and he understands it a different way. And as a matter of fact, you could hear a Hafez verse quoted from the pulpit by a cleric. But they would be using that verse in a different way. So in the same way that you can have an allegorical interpretation of the Song of Songs, how are you going to explain the breasts that are there? It's there. It's the only book of the Bible where the name of God is not mentioned. You can make an allegory out of it, but I mean, on one level, it's a love poem, and you have to admit that. On the other hand, if you only interpret it allegorically, if you only interpret the wine as a mystical revelation that comes to you from God, if that's what you understand as this thing that we were trying to describe before, this wine, then you can say you can use the wine without the language of the tavern. You can use this wine language without fear of heresy being shot back at you. So here, this is even more complex and ambiguous. The idea that not only is the language of wine forbidden, but it's also used by the clerics themselves to explain things, to communicate with the people, because it resonates. They'll use Hafez in a way that to add to the meaning, like it's like quoting scripture, something like that. Hafez is that important and that esteemed in the tradition.
Of course, I just want to add one more sentence to this, that in comparison between the poems of Ayatollah Khomeini and Hafez, I just want to on the spot translate another line from Hafez. The distances between my moon and the moon that shines in the sky.
So I don't recall exactly where I read this, but it may have been Ladinsky's liner notes, that many of Hafez's poems were lost because the traditional clerics threw them away. Is that accurate?
So this is okay. That brings the problems of textuality and what Hafez is, what Hafez as a poet is. So it's very different from many Western poets who come later and who have a very concrete textual history, like Shakespeare. We have the folios, and we have some of them written in his own hand. Hafez we have a problem in two places. One, unlike Rumi, who wrote extemporaneously, who spoke extemporaneously, and his disciples wrote down, and it was not changed. That tradition stayed the same, and so those poems stayed the same with the rhyme and everything. In Hafez's case, however, something different. He was someone who changed his poems all the time. So we may have 20 versions of the same poem with different words in them, okay? Now, and we may have different selections of different words and selections of different poems as the authoritative canon. So so the problem is, where do you begin? You go to the best scholar that you can find, the one that seems to be most authoritative, and you look at what they have, you look at what the next scholar has, the number of poems, the words that are used, and again, what has been lost we have no way of knowing, but that's a wonderful idea, the lost poems of Hafez. You can find them somewhere. I think they would shock people. But let me just finish that. So the idea is that once you find it, that's where you begin. Here is Hafez according to this editor's ideas of what the text actually is, and he's chosen himself from perhaps many different. How many versions are there in Iran that one could choose from?
There are quite a few. I have read about 12 or 13 different Hafez, and among them, the translations that you see, the text that you see we used was from one that is most popular, is most recognized as the best, the most comprehensive collection of Hafez. And even after we finished that, after we read that and translated, used the poems, the one of Ghaznavi, the Iranian friends are acquainted with that. After we chose that as a basis for our translations, then I happened to go back to Iran and I took our or Hafez's selection, because Hafez selected all these 50 poems, we didn't. Hafez's selection of these poems to Iran, to a good friend of mine who is a Hafez scholar, and he actually added and subtracted in a couple of places, so he changed about 8 or 9 little details about it.
So I'm curious about the changes in each poem. Is that kind of like the Appalachian folk tradition of these were spoken and sung by people and then transcribed later?
Yeah. So it's a common tradition in the ghazal, which is the form that we're talking about. The ghazals themselves are like sonnets. They have a monorhyme, and our first argument was over whether we can reproduce the rhyme. And so we really spend some time over that. And our idea, Ben, would be that logos is more important than melos, and so we need to get the images as clearly as possible. You lose the music, but on the other hand, something that we did, which was a risk that many other editions have not taken, is to put the Persian original next to it, so someone who knows both can see both the strengths and the weaknesses immediately of the translation. Also, in the ghazal, these couplets that are like rhyming couplets, something like that, they're closed units of thought, like popes, and so they're easy to memorize and easy to use in any particular situation. The ghazal, according to some people, is like a gazelle that jumps from thought to thought. Other people say, no, there's an underlying unity to every image, and they're all finely wrought together. And so, again, there are different things. But the naming oneself at the end of the poem, one could say, these are songs, really. They're even to this day, in Iran, you can hear, all you have to do is agree on a mode and begin singing, and the accompaniment will come and the song begins. There's no, and everyone would understand it, because this is the difficult thing. A man who's born and a contemporary of Chaucer is used in the streets today. That line about they've closed the doors of the tavern means, and has been used in 1979 to mean that they've taken freedom away from us, and this is a bad thing. At the end, it's there to show ownership of the poem, and it does something else. In the last lines, it's something like the rhyming couplet in Shakespearean sonnet, where it universalizes some way, or it does show ownership, and that ownership is built into the rhythm in the rhyme, so no one is going to mess with it. Hafez has written it; it's going to stay Hafez, and so he's sure when the singer is singing, the singer is not putting his own name in there and claiming my poem. So it's part ownership, but it's also a way of objectifying, because he uses the pronouns in the beginning, but in the end, it says back, Hafez, fame and shame, forget about it. So it's a way of objectifying the thing. And so you'll see shifts in who's speaking, and the speaker and the listener and Hafez. So there's three usually somewhere lurking in it, and that's one of the ways to understand that.
To add to this, there has been many different versions of every line or many of the lines of Hafez, because of the political and social circumstances that Hafez lived under. Remember, during the Hafez's time, we have quite a few changes in the government. From a king who would allow drunkenness and practice of freedom and in religion and practice of social customs, to the one who was as dogmatic as our supreme leader today is. And as such, those who were reproducing Hafez's poetry, in order to be able to sing it, they change words, they change connotations, they change phraseology in order to be able to make it acceptable. For example, a good example of it is در میخانه ببستند. Okay, means they close the doors of the tavern. So God do not allow them to open the door of hypocrisy and deceit. Now, there is در بتخانه ببستند. They close the door of the idol worshippers. Instead of meikhane, it's the same line, the same version, the same rhyme, the same meter, and there is a version of it that says dar butkhane bebast, and therefore it changes the entire poem around, that now is not the ones who are ruling the country, the supreme leaders, but now it is those who are trying to bring idol worshipping back into the country. They close their door, so in order to keep the ghazals survive.
The other important thing that Mahmood reminded me about is that Hafez himself, in his life, was a victim of that. So he was, very popular during the wine drinking regime, and when the opposite came, he was exiled. He lived his entire life in Shiraz, a beautiful city in the south, and that one time he was exiled, and he writes a lot about the feeling of exile and the desire to go home and the joy when he was brought back to another regime that liked wine, as a matter of fact. He was replaced. It worked out. So he understood that. He understood that.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Do you think of this as more of an oral tradition in a sense than a written? Is it something that's passed on and something that's adapted generation to generation according to the needs of the generation? Does it evolve, or is it really substantiated that these are the words of
The first Hafez the first written Hafez that we know of dates back to about 165 years after the death of him. So for about a century and a half, you have Hafez being recited. Therefore, thus the argument that no, this is not what he said, this is what he said, because nobody knows about it. But when you do the research and you find out that according to the tradition, according to the life of Hafez, according to other teachings of Hafez, what he had taught, maybe this word was the correct one, then you can discover the closest text to the truth. But yes, we talk about this in the introduction of our next book, that there is a big difference between Persian poetry and Western poetry. In Persian, we say a poem. We don't write a poem.
Right.
We say a poem. It's oral. In Persian, we read poem. It is a part of a discussion. It's a two-way street between the reader, not reader in terms of, but the sayer, the speaker of the poem, and the listener to the poem. In English, you write a poem. And the poem is published, and then you take the poem home, and in your own solitude you sit down and read it. And even in sometimes when we do have the poet himself or herself present, or somebody else reading the poet's words, it rarely becomes a two-way dialogue. Rarely becomes a spoken poetry and responses to the spoken poetry. That, as such, yes, the tradition of oral, oral tradition is really strong.
Not a literary object.
No. That's why it's important to say it. It's we learn to say the poems.
That it makes sense to me because that you said that it took 160 years or whatever before they actually wrote any of the Hafez down, because I really, on an energetic level, feel such a difference from Hafez to Rumi. Where Rumi, they did write down his actual words. There's a purity or something, I don't know, purity isn't really the right word, but there's a more single stream to Rumi. And to Hafez, it feels like there's a lot more voices in there. It's much richer in a different kind of a way, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's really different. It's like the difference between a calm lake and a brook.
It's denser, I think you could say. Now give me a chance to contradict everything that Mahmood has just said, and give him a chance to have a drink. I
love these things, This is how we lived for the past 7 years.
So I was lucky enough to see W.H. Auden give his last reading in New York City before he went back to England to die. And he recited poetry for 2.5 hours only looked once at a page. I think he missed a page and he opened it up and he got the word and then he went on. It was a spectacular performance. In general, though, our tradition is out of a book. The goal is to make a book. But again, we have to begin to distinguish, what do we mean by the tradition of Western poetry? Do we mean Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan, who come in through the ear, and you very rarely see those songs written down, or Joni Mitchell, or any of the other great artists whose poetry has affected my heart and changed my life? Or do we mean texts like Dylan Thomas or T.S. Eliot, which are book oriented? So in general, we try to talk about this distinction. But so I would say that in the West generally is not all that bookish. Sometimes there are these places, these pockets where the word comes in through the ear first, but rarely. Mostly it's you're looking in a book and it's the book that's the important thing. On the other hand,
Shakespeare is a good example of that too.
On the other hand, in Persian civilization, there is this bardic quality that flows through the whole thing, and where wisdom is located is not in a lawyer's office. It may or may not be in a cleric's office, but it is in the poet's page. Now, whether that wisdom is recognized by a singer in a tavern, a cleric quoting a poet from, in a mosque, or a reading straight on, or reading it straight on, it doesn't matter. The idea is authority. Authority comes through this language of Rumi, Attar, the other classical Persian poets, but especially Hafez. Some people even go so far to say that Iranian-ness is Hafez, is this pushing back of the boundaries of what is possible, is this freedom to express oneself at the limits of what can be said, not in this tiny little way of tiny little poems, but with great gusto and great compassion and kindness and tolerance, and against hypocrisy, and against those people who are false, and against the people who are tricking other people and hurting other people. So there's a great generousness in Hafez, and that's why it's that quality, difficult to grasp. You can sense it in some places that people find as the authority in the entire civilization, and I think we're from people who have no education whatsoever and learn their Hafez through hearing the couplets and remembering them like we would remember scripture, to intellectuals who argue over who has the best edition of Hafez. You'll find that everyone in Iran has the same feeling about Hafez, and they're proud of this poet. They love his works. They want to represent the images of his paintings, the images of his poems in paintings, and they want to sing these. They want to bring these poems to life. When they get together on an evening like this, Hafez comes out automatically. Rumi as well, Attar as well, but Hafez first.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to the point that you brought. Another distinction between Rumi and Hafez is that they both write poetry in a span of 20 to 23 years. About the same time, within a century difference between the two of them. However, Rumi has over 60,000 lines, and Hafez has only 345 ghazals. The reason for that is Hafez is a skillful editor. He goes back and re-edits his poems. Rumi never reads his poem again. Rumi says it and goes. Rumi is the poet of the heart, And interestingly enough, it also speaks to the location of these two people. Hafez is from Shiraz, a place that skill is very important. As you have seen around Shiraz, and I mean, they make wine, the best, most skilled wine we can imagine. They make miniatures. They draw. These are really skilled works. Rumi is from Khorasan, a place that people just say things. It's a desert land that you walk in and speak. Therefore, you really say exactly what's in your heart, without concern. Without concern. When you go through Rumi, when you go through Masnavi, for example, you see so many places you say, oh my God, did he say that? You really go back and say, wait a minute.
So they reflect their culture in there.
And it's that sense of spontaneity. Another difference between the two poets is that Rumi is a respected religious teacher with a huge group of followers at all times. He's never threatened by the regime of the city. He's well invited when the Mongols attack Iran, he's invited to go to Turkey, which was a part of Iran at the time, but to Konya. Hafez is always under pressure. Hafez always has to watch out and see what other atomic bomb is going to fall on his head. So his poems become a shield for him. This is really an interesting point about the two.
And its
Well, we'll see in
ambiguity
terms
is
of,
used that way too. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, in terms of his placement in society, was he?
He was very well respected, and then at times he was exiled. He couldn't go back to his. I mean, depending on who was.
Lower class, upper class.
Hafez comes from middle class family, middle upper class family, where teaching of Quran and teaching of Persian literature is very, very early on for him. He's 6 or 7 years old that he begins memorizing Quran. Therefore, he is knowledgeable. He knows Persian history and Persian mythology. He understands Zoroastrianism very well. He's well read. I mean, when you look at the images he uses, he's extremely well read. And he's a teacher. He has got a group who follow him of his students, but nowhere near where Rumi is in a sense of this vast respect that he has among the society. And of course we see what happens to Rumi the moment he meets Shams. He's broken into pieces. Doesn't know what to do next.
He meets who?
Shams of Tabriz.
His teacher.
His teacher.
The teacher. Yeah. Well, you had another question that you wanted to ask.
I think this idea that Rumi can't be stamped out. There's something. It's like he's a thread that's been woven so deeply that he can't be pulled out of the Persian psyche. That's a really interesting idea to me, and it makes me wonder if there's some sort of collective memory of pre-Islamic society, Zoroastrianism in ancient Persia, that is woven here, and this is a resonance that a continuity from those times in a way, because there's also these two kind of opposed sets of values you've been talking about as well. It makes you wonder if there's something about Hafez that resonates with the ancient past there in terms of the values.
Exactly. The same with Rumi. Now I'm going to take a risk in here and say something that a lot of wonderful scholars are going to contradict me, but so what is new? Sufism is philosophy born out of the marriage between Zoroastrianism and Islam. When Islam comes to Iran and Islam is imposed upon Iranians, the first thing they begin thinking is how are we going to save what we have? Our culture, our language, our buildings, our structures, our fire, temples. How are we going to save those? And of course, at any one of these possibilities, it's the elite who think about the ways to do it. And of course, the common man does what the elite tells them. So in terms of the structure, they immediately create these images that every one of the fire temples becomes the graveyard of some grandson of the Prophet. When you go into Iran, every one of Imam Zadeh, we call it, every one of them is a temple. It has the place for fire. It has, it is a Zoroastrian temple. I'll give you one little story. My wife is a historian, and when we were first married, we started driving around the country because I wanted to see my country that I hadn't seen very well, and I wanted her to tell me all this. And we go to this place that there is a huge mountain, and it's really, really impossible to climb. It's very, very tiring to climb all the way up to the top of the mountain. And all the way on top, there is a grave of one of the grandsons of the Prophet. And I said to the local people, I said, how did this happen? And of course, once we went up, we saw that it is a temple. And my wife told me that this used to be this and this temple, and this is the name of it, and this is the Zoroastrians who practice this their religion here. So I asked the local people, and they said, this is the story they told me. They said one day, this great-grandson of the prophet was running, and the enemy was going after him to kill him. And he, in his fear, he wanted to say, who, the word for God, who give me a refuge? And he said, Ku, give me refuge. Ku means mountain. He said, Ku, give me mountain refuge. Instead of who, give me. And therefore the Ku opened, the mountain opened, and he went in there. And that's it. You know, I mean, when you look at this story, you realize how skillfully they have created this. And then, in terms of the philosophy, when Zarathustra comes in and says, look, God is you. There's nothing outside of you. There are pieces of God inside every single one of you. And all you got to do is, through the observance of the three things, the good thoughts, good deeds, and good spoken words, you can amplify, you can purify yourself, you can allow this peace to grow inside you. Okay? Immediately the elite of the time come in and say, well, Quran says God is created from the breath man is created from the breath of God. Therefore, there is a peace. I mean, first line of Rumi, بشنو از نیچون حکایت میکنند. Listen to the reed as it tells the story. Why is it reed? And why isn't it a violin or a tar or a daff? Because reed, exactly, breath is the only thing that you can. You know, isn't this the same of Buddha? Isn't this the same of Zarathustra? You know, so they started saying, okay, now there's God inside every one of us. Therefore, we do everything Quran says that's good. And if you collect everything that Quran says can be categorized in these three things, good thoughts, good spoken words, and good deeds, you know, we do that, and this peace will grow inside us. And thus, Mansur Hallaj comes out and says, I am the truth. I am it. You know, Bayezid Bastami comes out and says, I am it. And they're right. And then, of course, the powers to be cannot fathom that, and they kill him. So that sense, that becomes Sufism. Somehow Persianizing Islam. And then through and of course we all know that for the first 300 years after Islam, we were not allowed to speak Farsi, Persian. You know, for the first 300 years, Persian were forbidden. And people kept the language alive by just speaking it among themselves and not allowing anybody else to hear it. And therefore, everything that they wrote it in Arabic. You know, we know that Omar, who came to conquer Iran, these are historical facts. He came and conquered Iran, and when he left, he took with him all the books of Zarathustra, and he built a temple, a fire temple for himself in Saudi Arabia. That he spent the rest of his old age, you know, at the fire temple. So there is all these, and he meditated there, you know, and thus became a respected, you know, superior being among his people. So you see that sense of changing and not overthrowing, but changing, but adapting. That sense is what we see today politically in Iran. That's why the people in Iran today are not interested in revolution. They do not want to topple the supreme leader. They do not want to topple this regime and bring another regime in. They want to change minds. They want to evolve. And we have seen, as a result, people like Dr. Surush, the very famous Sufi scholar, people like Ganji, these are people who supported this revolution 30 years ago. Ganji was a member of the Revolutionary Guards. But they evolved. They realized what is going on, and so are the people in the streets today. whether my generation or the younger generation, they have learned that they do not want to change anything. They want to evolve things. They want to move forward, which is what at the beginning of Islam happened. Now, I know that a lot of scholars hopefully will not hear this, otherwise I'll be in deep trouble.
Does anyone else have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Let's see if I can lay it out. Early in the evening, you said that the central theme of Hafez is freedom. And it's obvious that in a lot of Hafez there is this reaction from sincerity against hypocrisy, and at the social level there is a dynamic going on there. We Americans tend to see things very much in these terms. Freedom is a really strong American value. So these are two reference points in Hafez, but of course we know there's at least a third or first very important reference point, which is that which allows freedom, that which in some sense is, let's just say, the divine or the beloved, the friend. And I know maybe this question I'm going to address to Mahmood first,
Okay.
though our other brother here can certainly also speak. I guess my question is something like this. Hafez is more than a poet of individual freedom, of a human being breaking through social norms. What allows that freedom? What allows, what is it at the cosmic dimension that is really important? He's not just a rebel, he's not a social rebel. Something allows him to also be a social rebel and say, I'm not going, I have no fear, I'm not going to put up with this, these limitations, these falsities. So very indirectly, he's speaking about something ineffable, something so beautiful, so generous, that it frees him. Maybe I'm saying it, but I'd like to hear you speak a little bit about this.
If I understand your question correctly, I would like to respond by quoting Ali, the Imam Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet. He says, the truth is not something that's given to you. The truth is something that comes from inside you and then is reached the level of divine. حق گرفتنی است ندادنی. And Hafez, obviously, like all of us, all those people who believe in a spiritual, and I'm not putting a religious name on it, but a spiritual connection to the cosmos, a spiritual connection to the universe. All of us who believe in a certain spiritual connection between myself and the sun, myself and the universe. We know that the path begins from inside. And Hafez does that exactly. He says it is my pushing through this limitation, starting with the body, starting with the drinking, starting with the social. It's pushing through this limitation that allows the light inside me to shine and communicate to the cosmos, communicate to what is divine. Therefore, I don't really know what the American, you began talking about the American idea of freedom. I don't know what that is, and whether or not we believe that it is something that we should be given, not that something that we should gain, we should achieve, because at least in my recent history of 30 years living in this country, I have not seen that much activity to achieve freedom, to gain freedom. We have always asked for Supreme Court to give us the election, to give us the freedom. But in Hafez sense, it is you. If you cannot open it, if you cannot break through, Sheikh Baha'i says, if you break through the smallest atom, you will see a sun inside it. You know, if you break through inside yourself, that is the light that can come out. And that light can encompass not only you, but the society around you, your friends, your followers, your society, and on and on and on until it relates and becomes one with the friend, becomes one with the beloved.
But Mahmood, could it also be said that the light that Hafez experiences inside him is what gives him the courage and the freedom to then push the boundaries? That
Thank you.
The light itself is pushing him.
Thank you. Thank you. But the recognition of that light is very important.
Recognizing
It's
it.
not that we don't have that light.
No, he's seeing it and
Yeah.
recognizing it, and then he's wanting to give that out.
No, I mean, Hafez says we all have it. So does Rumi. Rumi says we all have that light.
Right.
If we don't recognize it, it's not the fault of the light.
So it's the light itself.
It's our problem. You separate yourself, Hafez. Get out of the middle.
Right. Yeah.
So you say Hafiz, I say Hafez. It's something like that. So it does mean at the very beginning an honorific that is an honorific in Arabic, but Persians Persianize it and call him Hafez. So that's and that ambiguity right there tells you something about, we can't even agree on the honorific to call him in English. So how are we going to find a set of symbols that are going to communicate to Americans what's going on in a very different contextual arena? We have to come up with some kind of rules for engagement in this. And Mahmood and I tried to enact that battle by questioning every assumption that we made about language that would be comprehended by people. And on my side, surely as an American, I bring this idea of freedom from Whitman and Emerson and Thoreau. But at least in Emerson and Thoreau's case, we have, again, part of this great chain of linking that we found, and everyone has found in Hafez. And that is that Emerson himself, knew of the work of Hafez and wrote a couple of poems in imitation of Hafez and Sadi's, so he knew this tradition of Sufism, passed that on to Thoreau. Thoreau passed that on to Martin Luther King. Gandhi also. Those are the names that come up in the streets today. Gandhi, Martin Luther King, not so much Emerson, not so much Thoreau, but those two certainly. And so we have this circular arrangement of cultures and meaning that goes that comes. So it has to do with I think trying to find concrete symbols that can communicate. Of course, the Buddha holds up a flower. One person in the audience is enlightened. No one else. It's a nonverbal teaching. It's ineffable. It cannot be spoken. The real meaning cannot be spoken. The real Hafez cannot be spoken. What you need is you need to jump into the river. You can't just be looking at it. And so there's something of that happening. Next, if we're going to try to communicate this essential quality of boundary breaking, fierce thinking, like Thoreau. Thoreau, is not afraid to go out into the forest and spend a couple of years thinking and reading the Bhagavad Gita. Emerson.
And going to the local tavern in Concord.
That's right, and drinking. He was not afraid of that. Yeah. I'm sure that's on his list of things to buy a little bit. Check the list and see if he's on that. Hafez is not afraid, as Whitman is not afraid to snuggle in between the husband and wife and say, hey, this isn't a bad place to be. And Hafez says things like this. He pushes gender distinctions. He's pushing on every expectation that you have. Now, I could call that freedom. You could call that a dissolving into the greatness of the other, which is beyond speaking or God. And either way, it means about the same thing. So essentially, here's what we have. We have the self, we have the other, and we have a third state, union. How are we going to describe that in language? Well, Hafez has a few strategies that he tries to use, but the essential result is the same. It is this union in which the I is completely dissolved into something that is more difficult to describe. That process can be described as drinking. It can be described as the infatuation of love. It can be described as the feeling that one has for the sake. It could be described as the righteousness that comes up in Emerson and Thoreau, and in Hafez as well, when he sees social injustice and points it out, and when he says that these people are hypocrites, and don't let hypocrites tell you what the truth is. Look for someone with an open heart. Look for someone who is a lover. Look for someone who has a glass that's open and asking, like a begging bowl. So that's really pretty much in the Buddhist terms, that's what this is. It's a begging bowl. And you go with your heart, which is basically a begging bowl, and you go to the other and you say, is there anything for me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just add one more little thing that our Iranian friend might appreciate knowing, if he doesn't already, maybe you do, but in this quintessential American ideal of self-reliance, which Emerson wrote an important essay on self-reliance. What he doesn't mean is self-reliance.
Yeah.
And in fact, he means reliance on the infinite.
Right.
And he ends it with a quote from Imam Ali.
Fantastic.
What was that?
I was wondering if you would ask. The quote is something like, Imam Ali said, your livelihood is seeking you even more than you are seeking it.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah.
Perhaps we should break for some real wine or tea or fruit, or
Okay.
conversation can continue.
Great. Thank you. This is beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.